Hi, my name is Kate Crawford. Thank you for coming to the virtual student poster session and for taking an interest in my research. I'm going to talk a little bit today about this project. For the past few years, I've been working with music instructors, which I think is a really interesting occupational group because their jobs require them to be exposed to high sound levels, some of which are loud enough to cause damage. And their jobs also require them to be able to hear and to hear well. So from an industrial hygiene perspective, I thought it was really interesting to try and figure out how to both assess and control the exposures for this group. And for this project, the idea was to use Monte Carlo simulations to actually start estimating the effects of control strategies on these exposures. And to do that, I used data from studies that I've done in previous years to kind of build up these simulations. So the first study I did was a personal sound exposure study where participants were wearing dosimeters and filling out activity logs. So I have all this task-specific exposure data from that. And I do have links in the methods section to posters I presented previously on those if you want more details. And then in the next year, we were in the audiology lab doing real ear attenuation at threshold testing for different hearing protection devices to see how well they were working for musicians. So now, along with the exposure data, I also have this attenuation data. So I kind of have an idea of how well these hearing protection devices might work. So with this Monte Carlo simulations, I used Oracle Crystal Ball and started estimating weekly exposures by breaking down a week into 30-minute blocks of time. And then from my exposure data, I know how likely it is that each block is a certain activity. And from the sound level data, I have an idea of what sound levels I'm expecting those 30-minute blocks to be. So now I can start estimating weekly exposures. You do that 5,000 times and you get an output, you get a distribution of weekly exposure estimates. And then, as I said, I also have this attenuation data, so I can start feeding that into additional simulations, and we can start seeing the effects of wearing hearing protection devices for different amounts of times might affect exposure. We can also see how the level of attenuation achieved with a hearing protection device may change and how that might affect exposure. So that's what we did with these simulations. And as you can see from figure 1, this is kind of the comparison of the different outputs we get. So the baseline exposure for weekly estimates is over here on the far right side. And then as we increase the amount of time that these folks are wearing hearing protection devices, we can see that that estimated weekly exposure distribution is getting pushed farther and farther to the left. And ideally, we want to be below this recommended limit, right? We want to be to the left of this 85 decibel limit line. And so we're not actually seeing that happen until the devices were worn 95% of the time. And even then, there's still a potential for overexposure. And so really what seemed to be the most effective was if we simulated wearing hearing protection devices anytime those activities exceeded 90 decibels. So it's not necessarily increasing the amount of time wearing it, but it's increasing the amount of time wearing them when there's the highest risk of exposure. And then figure 2 shows, again, if we keep that, the simulation set to wear hearing protection anytime it's above 90, we can see that if we adjust the attenuation, even if someone is achieving minimal attenuation with these plugs, wearing them at those most important times is really still doing a good job in keeping exposures below recommended limits. So effective interventions in the future should really focus on increasing the adoption rate of HPD during these specific musical activities that we highlighted. So personal practice sessions, group rehearsals, individual lessons, and performances. And wearing HPD 95% of the time may be effective. It also might be unnecessary. So really, if we can come up with a system to inform instructors of when their sound levels occur over 90, and that way they could be prompted to put in these hearing protection devices, that's actually going to be the best way to optimize hearing conservation. So this is ongoing work. We're still working with this. We have other instructional groups that we're running simulations for. And we can also kind of look at the appropriateness of of the timing and how we're describing these assumptions. But I think what this really shows is kind of a really interesting method to make these estimations and to start kind of informing our recommendations about when the best time to wear these devices will be. So thank you for taking the time to hear about this. I'm sorry I can't be there to answer questions, but I appreciate having the opportunity to share my work. So thank you.